Good afternoon. My name is Chris Paxson, and I'm Dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, and I'd like to welcome you all to this lecture where we're really going to focus on where we've come since 9/11. I think about 10 years ago, we were just beginning to get over the shock of what actually happened and starting to look forward. And there was a growing realization in the country that what had happened on that day was going to really reshape many things, how we do intelligence, how we think about domestic security. And so it's really great to have two people here today who have thought a lot about these issues and have some really interesting things to say about them. The way we're going to structure this is I am going to introduce my colleague, Kim Scheppele, very quickly, very soon, and she will introduce our speaker and also serve as a discussant when he's done with his remarks to kick off the conversation, and we will save time for conversation. So my colleague Kim Scheppele is the Laurance Rockefeller Professor of Public Affairs, and she's also a faculty member of the University Center for Human Values. She directs our program in law and public affairs, and she's been doing a lot of research and writing a book most recently that really looks at how 9/11 and the war on terror has shaped constitutional protections around the world. So I'm glad she could come. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you very much. I'm really thrilled to welcome all of you to this session with our very distinguished speaker, Chris Kojm. Chris is a Woodrow Wilson alum. I don't know whether he actually had classes in this room, but he might have. And we're always thrilled when he comes back home. The relevant thing that brings him to talk about the 9/11 Commission report, which is what's advertised on the posters, is that Chris Kojm was the deputy executive director of the 9/11 Commission in 2003 and 2004. This commission had 20 months to both figure out what happened in 9/11 and to figure out what to do to prevent it. And the end result, the 9/11 Commission report, is an astonishing book. It's, for one thing, a gripping read. So if you haven't read it yet, I urge you all to do so. It is by no means dated, because the 9/11 Commission report actually produced three rather amazing effects. The first is that it created a history that hasn't been shaken by all the events since. And those of you in the room who have ever worked in archives and ever worked writing history know that 3 years after the event and 20 months of work hardly ever produces something that stays still for this long. So that was really an amazing accomplishment. The second thing is that even though there are relatively few conspiracy theories and deviant accounts floating around in the world about 9/11. There are some. But there are relatively few relative to what you would expect, and a lot of that has to do with the public process that the commission went through to bring the public on board and to write this thing in such a gripping fashion that literally it is a page-turner, which is not something you can say about most national commissions. And third, the commission recommended a whole series of really quite root and branch changes to the organization of American government, to the organization of intelligence collection, everything about security. And 10 years later, or actually 7 years after the report's now out, about 75% of the recommendations have been met, at least mostly, which is, again, a really astonishing measure of success. Now, when you find out who Chris Kojm is, you can see that he's one of the main movers behind this report. The report was written, had a national commission of 10 members, half Democrats, half Republicans. Most of you will know that our former governor, Tom Kane, was one of the co-chairs, along with Lee Hamilton. And as Chris Kojm just told me, the commission was really very involved. But the executive director, Phil Zelikoff, and the deputy executive director, Chris Kojm, managed a staff of about 80 people who did more than 1,000 interviews, huge amounts of document searching, amassed a huge amount of intelligence into what is really an extraordinary report. It is coherent, it is gripping, it has a plot, it has outcomes, it has clarity, it's a really model report, which is why I think they put him in the job he's in now, which is he's now chairman of the National Intelligence Council at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. He's in that job, I think, for a couple of reasons. That's the council that actually thinks about it's the center of strategic thinking in the U.S. intelligence community. And as he had to do with the 9/11 Commission, it takes evidence from all over the place and tries to figure out what it all means. Once you read the 9/11 Commission report, you too would actually pick Chris Kojm exactly for this job. He came to that job from a whole series of other posts that actually are also very impressive. He was a senior advisor to the Iraq Study Group in 2006, which was a group co-chaired by former Secretary of State James A. Baker and Lee Hamilton, with whom he worked on the 9/11 Commission. After this 9/11 Commission report was issued, he was president of the 9/11 Public Discourse Project, which was a nonprofit group dedicated to public education about the recommendations of the Commission. He was also, between 1998 and 2003, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence Policy and Coordination in the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. I have to say he was also a teacher at one of our competitor schools at GW, at the Elliott School of International Affairs, but we also got him first and brought him back to the Woodrow Wilson School, where he taught in 2004-05 and then again in 2006. I'm always absolutely delighted to welcome back one of our MPA alums who's done good and who's done many things in the world, many of which he can't talk to us about today, but the one thing he can talk to us about is the 9/11 Commission report. And so with that, Chris Kojm.
Thank you, Kim, for that lovely introduction. Thank you, Dean Paxson, for inviting me here, and thank you all for coming today. I aim to talk for about 20 minutes. I hope to stick to that, certainly to leave time for questions and a discussion that we can have together. I really want to talk about three themes. One is about the report itself. That will be backward-looking. Then I will bring us to the present tense, to how the Commission's reforms have impacted the world I'm in now, the intelligence community. What has been achieved, and also what remains to be achieved. And then I will also want to talk certainly how what has been achieved has impacted the world I am in now in terms of analysis, and why I think we've made important progress in the nature of our work, understanding full well that when you do estimative work about the future, you, as Yogi Berra said, you've got to be very careful when you're talking about the future. So, but let me start with a bit of a backward look, speaking about the 9/11 Commission report. Governor Kane, who was the chairman, and former Congressman Lee Hamilton, the vice chairman, wanted to make a difference. Now, everybody wants to make a difference. But they were very, very conscious of past commissions that had ended up as doorstops, as bookends, as objects to be dusted, if not to be tossed out for recycling. They were very conscious of a commission that had immediately preceded the 9/11 Commission, the Hart-Rudman Commission. Anybody remember that one? It did excellent work, and when its report came out, they couldn't get the White House to meet with them. They had one hearing. The report dropped out of the news after the news cycle after a day or two. They were also very conscious of other seminal events in U.S. history, attack on Pearl Harbor, assassination of John F. Kennedy, and commissions followed each of those. Well, there were several Pearl Harbor commissions. They went back and forth, blaming Admiral Kimmel, releasing him from blame. Those commissions were not long remembered or noted. And then there was the Warren Commission that was deeply divided among its members. Failed in putting to rest conspiracy theories. All of us know about the grassy knoll and the second shooter. And was it one bullet that killed Connally and Kennedy, and on and on. So they were very conscious of the need for a commission report that could speak definitively to a gripping moment in American history, and where I'll just simply ask, and I think I know what the answer is, who remembers where you were when you heard about 9/11? Well, it's about everybody. And that was true a generation ago for JFK and 2 generations ago for Pearl Harbor. So we felt we had a responsibility to tell a story to the American people about what happened and why. Kane and Hamilton were deeply conscious of the importance of bipartisanship. There's nothing that will kill a commission so much as dissenting views in a minority report. They were also keenly conscious of the need to bring along the American public, to write a report in a way that anyone who wished to know about the event could pick up the document and absorb it. We really were looking for people, if you had a high school education, you could read this document and understand it. We also wanted it to be a story, a compelling story, because the events are, and to draw in the reader and engage him or her. So, how do you do this? Well, as has been mentioned, we pulled together a staff of about 80, and it was an intense dive into documents, and we went into the high weeds of partisanship. What could be more partisan than who is to blame for 9/11? Was it former President Clinton? Was it President Bush? Who done it? Who's responsible? Well, that wasn't the mandate we had. Our mandate was to tell the facts and circumstances of the event. We were not an inspector general. We were not a commission of inquiry. We certainly were not an arm of the Justice Department. And so we proceeded on a bipartisan basis, and as Kim has mentioned, we held a series of hearings throughout. And in the 6-7 months before the report was issued, there were hearings where we brought former officials before us. And each of the hearings were preceded by staff reports. And our guidance was clear, to endeavor to be as objective and as factual and as dispassionate we could be about what we had learned. This was our guiding principle. It was also a necessary one, because with what began as an intensely partisan membership of the commission, all that we could get commissioners to agree on would be the facts and not interpretations of the facts. Our commissioners were deeply involved in the report. The staff did the drafting, as you might expect, but the editing process and review was done by the members, and on politically controversial topics, they drafted and redrafted and commented extensively. But we reached agreement, and that was because of a relentless assertion of the factual record, not seeking to describe it or characterize it. So a lot of adjectives and adverbs disappeared from the prose. And so by the time we issued the report, because we had a process of public inquiry and hearings and moments when the chair and vice chair spoke to press conferences and to the American people about our work, the public was deeply engaged. And so they were in a mood to wish to read the report when it came out. And we published it through a commercial house, in addition to the government printing office, and we went through a commercial house because it promised us the following. We can turn your copy around in 7 days. We can have it in every bookstore in the nation for $9.95. That was part of the strategy. It was quite interesting. I watched a conversation between Chairman Kane and Vice Chair Hamilton. Vice Chair Hamilton, a former member, said, "Tom, we need to engage members of Congress. We've got to start telling them about the report. We've got to bring them along." And Governor Kane said, "Lee, that's a good idea. You go ahead and do that." And and Mr. Hamilton said, well, Tom, it doesn't sound to me like you have a whole lot of enthusiasm for this idea. He said, no, it's a good idea. You go ahead and do that. And the point he said is, we need to talk to members of Congress, but what really matters here is engaging the public. If you move the public, members of Congress will follow. And of course, that's what happened. After the report came out in July of 2004, by December of that year, we had a major overhaul of the intelligence community and a bill signed into law by the President that enacted and began to implement many of the recommendations of the Commission. Let me turn to, fast forward here to where we are today. What has been achieved with respect to reform? And here I'll focus my remarks on the intelligence community since it's where I work now and what I know best at the present time. I left the intelligence community in 2003. I returned in 2009. And I have to say, I see a lot of remarkable and good change. The thing that is above all hardest to change is culture. Every institution has a culture, and high-profile institutions that have a clear sense of mission change very slowly. It is a hard slog over time to bring change in government organizations. On one hand, this is a good thing. We have a bureaucracy, we have a system of government because we want it to be stable and predictable. This is good. That's why we've been around for 235 years. On the other hand, that makes change hard, and change requires constant dedication by leadership, communicating the message and ensuring that it's implemented. I think our directors of national intelligence have made impressive progress on cultural change, which has been manifested in important ways through better information sharing, IT systems that help support that information change. There's also a system of joint duty. If you want to be a senior officer in the intelligence community, it's just like in the military. You have to serve in another service, you have to serve in a joint duty position, you have to learn how the other guy in the other organization works. And that joint duty requirement is keenly important in fostering a common sense of identity for the emerging senior leadership. And so I think our director now, he's really in a sweet spot in terms of his understanding of what his mission is. It's not for him to run the 16 agencies of the intelligence community or tell them how to do their jobs. It's a big operation. It's, as the Washington Post notes and is publicly on the record, it's a budget of about $80 billion a year between the intelligence community and related defense intelligence activities. It's scores of thousands of people. So he can't run those 16 organizations, but what he can do is create a sense of unity of effort and serve as the relentless integrator, seeking always to bring the community together on collection, on analysis, on serving the policy customer. So I think we've made important progress, and we've crossed the foreign domestic barrier on work on counterterrorism, and the FBI and DHS are key partners with the intelligence community as we seek to work together on all source analysis to protect the country against the terrorism threats we face. And there's been significant progress in bringing agencies together productively. Just a word about the challenges that are still before us, and that length too is not short. Information sharing is, I don't want to say it's an unnatural activity, but Bureaucracies have a long history of keeping information to themselves. He who controls the information controls outcomes. And so we've moved now from a principle of need to know to responsibility to share. We can't keep this country safe. We can't serve policymakers unless you share information. But that requires continuing attention and leadership. And so not only do we need to share, but we have to create communities of interest. IT systems that allow all analysts to work together on highly sensitive problems, no matter where they are located. And that's not easy to do for reasons of IT in part, reasons of culture, and simply reasons of protecting sources and methods. So that too needs lots of time and attention. And the other challenge, of course, is the direction of budgets. From 9/11 to the present day, the intelligence community had significant increases in its budget, roughly a doubling over the last 10 years. And with more money, you can do a lot more things. That is certainly true. The real challenge for the director going forward is how to foster integration in a declining budget environment, and to make sure that the choices we make as budgets go down seek to enhance further collaboration and not pull us apart. And that is a significant challenge for him and for us. Let me say a word about how all these changes have affected the work I do in the present day at the National Intelligence Council. And we have been the beneficiary of greater information sharing, greater collaboration across the community. It significantly enhances our work when the 16 agencies have different responsibilities and different unique talents. If we're working on terrorism questions, in addition to all the agencies that work outside the borders of the United States, we need strong contributions from FBI, from DHS. If we're working on Mexico, we need the Drug Enforcement Agency as a player at the table. If we're working on questions about countries that are not at the top of the policymakers list for the intelligence community, we will rely very heavily on State Department reporting and open source what is freely available through the internet or public sources. So the changes in the community have enhanced our ability to bring information and analysts to the table, and I think quite effectively. And so at the National Intelligence Council, we really need everyone to participate. And my role as chairman is to ensure that views are put forward for the policymaker, including where the community is not in agreement. And I take that very seriously. If there is a dissent in the community, we need to document that, spell it out concisely and clearly. And then in addition, if it's on an important question, to flag it in our key judgments for our policy customers. And they appreciate that. When you're a consumer of what we do, the eye is always drawn to where is the disagreement. And it's important for the policymaker to focus on that disagreement. Why? Most of our work involves countries and questions that are on the front pages of newspapers, of intense interest to the policymaker, and we seek to look at these questions looking out 1, 3, 5 years ahead. We call it estimative work. It's not prediction work, we don't have crystal balls, but we do estimative work and try to spell out through scenarios and looking at key drivers, how might events go? And guess what? That is hard to do when you have incomplete information on hard questions where there are gaps on what you know and can know. because other governments, of course, are careful to protect their information. And so when all analysts have the same information, but it's incomplete, and you have very smart people, it is not at all surprising that they will come up with different interpretations and different understandings of how those events might unfold in the 1 to 3 or whatever the time frame, year time frame is. And so as we produce our products and then engage with our policy customers and have a dialogue on these questions and explore our analysis of these hard questions, it is the best service we can provide to the policy customer. I'm often asked, do we get into the policy business? And the answer is no. Our job is to support policy. There's a bright line between policy advice and intelligence support. Now, my job is to make sure we get right up to that line, but don't cross it. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that our job is to make sure that we're fully informed and engaged with our customers to know what it is they're working on, what are their questions, where does our work really matter and can help dispel the great uncertainty that surrounds the implications of hard questions for decision makers. If we, as a government, were to do X, what are its implications? What's the fallout? What are the second-order consequences? We can help the policymaker on those questions. But we can't, if we cross that line and start to say, you should do, you must do, it is important that you do. No, our job is to say, well, if this scenario happens, these are how we think events will unfold. That's how we can. The Intelligence Reform Act, I think we're in a better place as an integrated community to do that. Okay, thank you all for your time and attention. I'm happy to respond to your questions.
Thank you. I'm in the position of commentator, but also someone whose official job is opening some topics that perhaps Chris can't quite talk about, just to put them on the table for some questions. The first thing I want to say is that if one of our topics today is the 9/11 Commission report and what it's actually achieved, it's really remarkable how much has changed as a response to the 9/11 Commission report. So let me just give you a little list of things. So one is the creation of the office in which Chris is currently employed. So the Director of National Intelligence was an office created following on these recommendations of the 9/11 Commission report. The National Counterterrorism Center, which collects a lot of data about terrorism threats around the world, another creation. Anyone who's gotten a driver's license in New Jersey in the last 5 or 6 years knows that the new system of secure driver's licenses, again, also a recommendation and a report to create more secure identity documents from the 9/11 Commission. Anyone who's been to Canada or Mexico recently and didn't used to have to show a passport and now does, another 9/11 Commission report. Increased use of no-fly lists and other things that many of us find to be annoyances at airports, including explosive screening, increased security of all kinds. The TSA was actually founded before that, but increased tasks and responsibility for the TSA. There's now something called an incident command system, not all the way there yet, but that FEMA's running to try to coordinate first responders when it comes to terrorist attacks and other such things. The CIA has been fundamentally reorganized and rebuilt. The Special Operations Command within the Defense Department has now started coordinating a new set of operations made necessary by the global war on terror. A lot of information sharing across the government. I could go on and on. Essentially, the security apparatus of the United States has been completely and fundamentally reformed as a result of 9/11, but particularly if you look at the specific list as a result of the 9/11 Commission recommendations. And perhaps the most important change since the Commission issued its report is that the public is no longer panicked. And part of that, you could say, is because there haven't been domestic attacks. But it isn't because there haven't been domestic threats. If you've been following the news, there have been a number of really serious near misses, including the bomb that almost went off in Times Square, including the Mr. Zazi, who was arrested having been on the verge of plans to blow up Kennedy Airport, including the underwear bomber, as he's come to be called, who almost blew up an airline over the skies in Detroit, and on and on and on. The threats are actually real, and they're harder to detect because they're sort of smaller, and they're a little bit more coming in under the radar. But what's been very impressive is that this net that's been created, partly as a consequence of the reorganization of the intelligence community, has really been quite effective. So one question we might ask, usually the question is with respect to security, and up until the last year the question has always been, at security-related conferences, have we done enough? Is there something more we should do that we haven't done? Is there an additional kind of initiative that we should undertake? And actually today what I want to suggest is that maybe the question we might ask at this stage is, should we be doing less? Right? Have we done enough? In an era of budget cutting, have we actually gone overboard on security? And here I wanted to cite some numbers from the series that Chris mentioned. Dana Prieston and William Arkin did a series of investigations for the Washington Post called Top Secret America. Here are some of the things that they discovered, and I realize Chris may not even be able to comment on these numbers. So what they discovered is that there are some 1,271 government organizations and 1,931 private companies that work on programs related to counterterrorism. And they do that in about 10,000 locations across the United States. There are more than 850,000 people who hold top secret security clearances. Huge number, given that secret information, well, it's secret. Not so secret when not 850,000 people know it. A lot of the new intelligence and security agencies do the same work. So, for example, there are 51 federal organizations and military commands operating in 15 U.S. cities that only track the flow of money to and from terrorist networks. 51 organizations. So you might say, well, but that's because there's this big threat. So what we need to do, though, is we need to find out, so what are the threats? How do we know about them? Well, in any given year, there have been about 50,000 intelligence reports published every year. A volume so large that I bet even Chris can't keep track of them all. It's just a huge output of these constant security reports, to the point where you wonder whether it's really possible to make sense of it all, right? And even in preparation for today, I had sort of lost track of how many of the 9/11 Commission recommendations had actually been carried out. So, not surprisingly, there were a whole bunch of 10th anniversary of 9/11 reports that tried to make sense of how far along we were in complying with the Commission's recommendations. And what I found was that there was a report from Homeland Security, from FEMA, from Immigration and Customs Enforcement, from the TSA, from the Senate Intelligence Committee. I could go on and on and on. In other words, plus lots and lots of NGOs that were writing reports. The government is not a coherent body when it comes to even assessing whether the results of this one report have been carried out, right? So all of that makes me wonder whether we're now at the stage with respect to the proliferation of security operations, whether at some point less might be more. And here's one, in just reviewing the Commission report again, I was so struck by the fact that the Commission so rightly identified that one of the key problems before 9/11 was that the information wasn't coordinated and the information wasn't being processed together. That the U.S. had a lot of clues about the identities of the hijackers, about the nature of the plot. Nothing slam dunkish, but something that could have at least provided some basis for action. And in fact, all that detail was kind of lost in the noise. So now, or to switch metaphors, so the Commission report said, we're going to be in the business of finding needles in haystacks. We've got to figure out how to sort through haystacks more efficiently, how to build the more efficient haystack. And what we've done is we've proliferated the haystacks, so that now we've got whole fields of haystacks, and lots of people generating intel. So one question that I've got now is whether The peak of 9/11 reaction has now gotten to the point where it may be somewhat counterproductive, and especially in an era of budget cutting, whether we now should think about which pieces of this are really essential, right? Not to cut back below what the US needs, but to ask whether it needs actually this much. And the $80 billion budget figure, which was, by the way, another recommendation of the 9/11 Commission, that the total intel budget be made public for the first time, has now, of course, provided ammunition for people like me who worry about these things to say, is $80 billion really the right number? Let me make just a second comment, because again, in reading the 9/11 Commission report, among the really wonderful things about it was that it was so thoughtful about the role of US foreign policy and thinking through the challenges as the US entered into a new kind of dangerous environment. And so the report said, you know, we've really we've really got to deal with some of the problem countries, and they single out Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, shall we say. If you didn't already know it in 2004, when the report was issued, they were right on about which countries to focus on. And they said we really have to think about how to delicately handle these countries that seem to be playing both sides of the fence, as it were. And they recommended that one of the things the US do was to engage in a number of public outreach programs to convince the Muslim world that the US was not the enemy of the whole global Muslim community, and that the US stood for public values of democracy, of human rights, and so forth, and that one of the most effective things the US government could do in the world was to promote those values, right? Arab Spring, you read this and you think Arab Spring is coming, but of course they didn't know that. It was quite remarkable. So here too is where I wonder whether the Commission report doesn't recommend things that are somewhat at odds with that, because what that part of the Commission report recommends is a kind of public diplomacy, right? That the public values and commitments of the US should be visible in our open foreign policy. And yet, of course, this is really, as Chris I think so rightly put it, it's an intelligence war, right? Or it's an intelligence conflict. It's a conflict that relies crucially on gaining intelligence, not only from within the borders of the United States, but it requires getting intelligence from our allies and sometimes quite troublesome countries abroad. And here's where I have another question that Chris may not be able to speak to, but that I at least wanted to put on the table, and that is, what happens to those public values that the United States stands for when we work hand in glove with security services that we rely on for the kind of intelligence we need to fight this war, but where those security services may be engaged in methods and in local projects that the US's public values do not support? We saw this, I'll just take an example not from the US, but when Gaddafi's compound fell a couple of weeks ago and the rebels went in and took out all these papers, one of the things that was discovered was that the UK had actually been involved in a couple of renditions of some couple of terrorism suspects that they captured to Gaddafi's security services for torture and questioning. That one didn't involve the US, actually. And so then you wonder, so how credible is it that the US has a public foreign policy that reveals these values and yet works under the table with security services who do these kinds of things? Now, this is not to say, how to put it, Chris will know much more about what we're actually doing. As someone who doesn't hold a security clearance proudly, so therefore I can talk about these things, all I want to say is that the 9/11 Commission spotted exactly what the right problem was. And I wonder whether the solution of beefing up our intelligence commitments and doing, and as of necessity, these kinds of intelligence gathering operations have to happen in secret. And I'm wondering if our public values are as revealed as we work with the security services of other countries as they are in our public foreign policy. So all of this is just to say that the problem posed by 9/11 and the problem posed for American security around the world is a serious one, and one that puts the US up against a lot of its own public commitments in the name of its own security. But at least I think what we have going for us now is a reorganization of the intelligence community, as Chris mentioned, which I think has made it somewhat more efficient at trying to gather all of this information. And one of the great products of the 9/11 Commission and its recommendations has been to produce a country that feels safe to unclench and to actually be able to think about these things. So, thank you.